Hello, and welcome back to AI Ramblings, episode 38, with Neal McQuana over here and me, Michael Parekh. Thanks for joining us. We have a lot of things to go through today in the world of AI, some of the key items that we think require some interesting thought and discussion. Number one, Apple, after months of speculation, is going with Google Gemini to power AI Siri and a lot of other Apple intelligence services. This is big news. It extends the Apple-Google relationship that's been in place, and there's a lot to talk about here, especially relative to OpenAI, etc. Number two, Apple and Nvidia are hugely reliant on Taiwan Semiconductor to create all the chips that basically we use, not just for AI in terms of ChatGPT and so on, but also all Apple devices. And Taiwan Semiconductor is important because they control over 70-80% of all the chips that we use in almost every piece of electronics. And over the last 2 or 3 years, they have been super concentrated, with Apple and Nvidia being 40% of their business. And that's increasing, especially with Nvidia skewing. And this is important to talk about because TSMC is a key linchpin to how our world works, especially with the geopolitical concerns in terms of US-China and US-China and Taiwan. So that's an important thing to just touch on and talk about. Number three, also this week, the US signed a big trade deal with Taiwan, and actually Taiwan and TSMC being a key part of this. And the big headline is Taiwan is committed to $250 million of investments. Actually, let me take that back. $250 billion investments in the US in chip capacity and other investments in the US, with another $250 billion of credits. So that is a big number. It is a deal that basically is ahead of a potential grand US-China trade deal later this year. So there's a lot of geopolitics. It has huge implications for US tech, the US economy, for Apple, for Nvidia, and everybody else in the tech world. So that's number three item to talk about. And number four, we wanted to talk about Google continuing its role with Gemini 3.0 and all these other things that they've been rolling out at the end of last year. But they announced a huge leap forward in interoperable e-commerce and AI agent standards called the UCP, Universal Commerce Protocol, where they're partnering with companies like Walmart and Shopify and Target and dozens of other retailers. And this basically provides a new interoperable framework in addition to things like Model Context Protocol from Anthropic and other similar things that have been coming from Google and other companies that basically accelerate the interoperability of AI this year, especially for AI reasoning and AI agents amongst all the providers. So the UCP announcement from Google is a big deal, and we wanted to touch on that. So those are the four big topics, plus a whole bunch of other things we want to talk about. And before we go into the Apple-Google deal, I think the first three are just important to kind of just kick around. Neal, any thoughts on the other three items before we jump into our main topic of the day?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, obviously we want to hold discussion a second for the Apple Google thing, but it really does feel like, even with the last piece that you discussed with UCP, Google really is in a position now where it seems like it's theirs to lose. It's something that you had discussed a couple of years back when OpenAI had their big ChatGPT moment, that Google in the long run, placing your bets on them. And it does seem that that is really the spot that we find ourselves in right now. Regarding the UCP protocol, there's something I'll discuss a little bit later in the episode with one of my reads of the week, but it has to do with just this whole agentic shift that's happening and the generalization of agents outside of just code in everyday tasks. And I think, we've discussed this a little bit, where the real value will come when these things are generalized to the everyday person to be able to automate their tasks. And UCP is just another step towards that direction. And yeah, I mean, I think, the biggest chunk of our discussion here is really going to happen on the Apple Google side of things.
I think that is well summarized. We, by the way, have a lot of detail links and write-ups on a lot of these items. So please look at our show notes where, if you're so inclined, you can get a lot more detail on some of these items that we're talking about, plus their broader significance. Now, let's jump into the main topic of the week, Neal, the Apple-Google Gemini deal. We don't have all the financial terms of this, but Apple will be likely paying Google at least $1 billion or more to be able to customize a version of Gemini for Apple's purposes around Apple Intelligence and so on. It, you know, it has been framed a little bit by a lot of observers as Apple can't catch up to the other companies on AI and they're capitulating and they're going with Google on this. It's actually very different from a different framework from my perspective, that Apple really does not need to be a large language model developer per se. They already have a partnership with OpenAI that they're leveraging with ChatGPT, etc. We don't know how that will be emphasized or de-emphasized in the context of this deal. But Apple has made it clear that they're going to be integrating a lot of models and a lot of smaller models over the next year or two and more, especially on device. And this Google Gemini integration is but a first step. Apple's bread is buttered by providing deep AI functionality into all the applications that they provide, and the software companies who use Apple as a distribution platform through the Apple Store, etc., leverage. So Apple has a lot of value to add on AI, and it's just barely begun. And so I wanted to just underline that as a key piece. The timing on all of this is supposed to be in the second quarter, but it's likely, we'll see more detail on this at the Worldwide Developer Conference from Apple mid-year, and then we'll see a lot more in the fall. What do you think, Neal?
Yeah, it doesn't feel like it's really that big of a surprise anymore. I think this is something a lot of us have seen coming in the news last couple of months, that Apple has been a bit behind with their own internal efforts here and has chosen to go with Google. Of course, they partnered up with OpenAI originally with the Siri revamp, V1 if you want to call it, a little while back. Regarding the Google side of things, I think it's going to be really interesting to also see how this integrates into other areas where Siri exists. One area obviously being Apple Home and all of the Apple Home devices. We know that Google obviously has a big vested interest in their own home product line. And how will a Siri integrated with Google Gemini work on Apple devices? What will the value add be to stay in the Apple ecosystem when you can just go to Google and get the direct access to that model? This is obviously stuff that most people won't think about. They just want a speaker that'll answer the questions that they ask throughout the day. But I think it all goes to say that this will really change up potentially how Apple approaches integrating Siri into all their devices and what this modified version of Gemini will look like in terms of, as you said, we don't know the details, what type of model, what type of deal has been structured here. But yeah, I think a lot more questions and answers, as is usually the case with this stuff. I think it'll be a good step in the long run for Apple to hopefully get their act together when it comes to Siri, which has been a long way.
And Siri, by the way, most of us, we've been looking at this in terms of what will Apple do with Siri. But it's important to remember that even though Siri is viewed as being behind things like Amazon Alexa and Google's own voice services on Gemini, etc., Siri still has 1.5 billion queries a day, which is a big number given that, Apple's ecosystem is 1.5 billion, 2 billion phones around the world, at least one query per user around the world on Siri. And it's not out of the scope of possibilities that could multiply a lot more with a Gemini powered Siri, and recognize that Apple is more likely than not to use the branding of Gemini. This is going to be Apple product. This is going to be customized with their trust and privacy protocols. There's going to be a lot of customization here. So I think it's important to assume that this is not just Gemini under a white label brand. This is potentially Gemini that is Appleified in many, many different ways. And that's what's going to make it potentially a lot more interesting, as well as creating a lot of win-win value for both parties, especially in terms of the distribution of Google's core Gemini products relative to OpenAI. I also had a big piece this Sunday on OpenAI having a lot of momentum independent of all of this stuff that's going on in Google Gemini. And that would be a useful thing to kind of keep in mind, because OpenAI is also not resting on its laurels of its dominance in terms of their brand leadership around the world with ChatGPT, and they're very aggressively focused on also making their product better, getting distribution out there, etc. So this will remain a very dynamic space for the rest of the year at least. So stay tuned. Which takes us to our next topic, away from the major topic is our watch and read of the week. And Neal, you can kick it off in terms of what you found most interesting in this.
Yeah. My piece for this week came from an article on The Verge titled "You Sound Like ChatGPT," and it kind of goes along with this thing that I feel like we've discussed a dozen times now on the podcast, but it's a really well-written piece that shows how people's reliance and over-reliance on ChatGPT and these other large language models has also changed the way that they're now beginning to talk in social situations. We obviously saw it initially with text, how people would write, because in most cases they would just cut and paste from ChatGPT. That a lot of the expression and creativity that would come in writing, a lot of the nuances and sometimes the human flaws of writing, which make writing what it is to most people, started to get a bit sanded away, and we were left with this very sterile, politically correct way of writing where there wasn't much expression and everything seemed to follow a specific cadence and structure. And it's a piece that does a good job of highlighting a lot of the research that has been done in this space and how there are certain words that are popping up now in dialect that maybe didn't as much before, that are leaning towards evidence that show that this stuff is really transforming the way that people talk now in everyday situations. Some of the words that they mentioned, which were kind of favored, involved meticulous, delve, realm, and adept. Those were up to 51% more in a lot of these academic YouTube videos than in prior years, just showing that this cross-pollination of chat interfaces and text generation combined with scripts that people are using to give a lot of these talks and also just in their everyday conversation is changing the way that we talk to one another, which I thought was an interesting phenomenon that maybe isn't as surprising as expected. But yeah, that was my read of the week.
No, I thought that was a terrific article. I would encourage everyone to read this. There's a lot of detail in here in terms of the studies. So there's a lot of documentation in terms of the stuff. The thing I would highlight is that this is early. Remember, we have 900 million weekly users of ChatGPT. We're going to go into the billions. We've got lots of other large language model players. So this impact of how this affects our language or discourse out there, both in spoken form, written form, it's going to be fast evolving. And as a person who looks at technology from an optimist point of view, from a perspective of glass half full, look, I think this augments our speech. It augments our ability to hopefully think and reason better with the help of these tools. And in as much as these technologies help us think through things a lot better with their analysis that then get incorporated into our spoken and written word is a positive thing. But we need to be mindful of the impact, which is why this article is and the studies underlying them are important to note. So I'm glad you brought it up as our read of the week. My read of the week is on the financial side, as one might expect, given my background. Anthropic just is close to signing up a financing that's going to be about $25 billion on a $350 billion valuation. But this year is going to be important in terms of at least 3 to 6 major AI companies potentially looking to do IPOs. Anthropic and both OpenAI are potentially have an opportunity for that, although OpenAI may be a little bit later. SpaceX is another one that is eyeing $1 trillion or more IPO. We've got a article in my read of the week that kind of outlines some of the companies, not just in AI but in technology broader as well, that are important to note. And a lot of uncertainty from a macro point of view this year, of course, trade, tariff issues, a lot of the stuff that's going on that front may calibrate the timetable of these companies. But the enthusiasm for investors to commit big amounts of capital to AI build out remains relatively good, with flashing green lights on that. So these companies will more likely than not, as long as the macro environment continues to support it, move toward an IPO pipeline for this year, which it would be an interesting thing in the sense that in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, we've seen a contraction of public companies out there in general, and this would kind of be a resumption of companies being available to broader investors out there from a public market point of view. So the IPO pipeline for 2026 is my read of the week, which takes us to our obsession of the week. Neal, what have
Yeah.
you been? I think today both our obsessions may be kind of triangulating. So I'll let you kick it off and I'll follow up as well on it.
For sure. Yeah, it's something I touched on a bit earlier when we were talking about the whole Google UCP emergence. It's a piece from the Wall Street Journal talking about how Claude and Claude Code has made a lot of really powerful changes in the last, couple weeks, very recently, that is opening up the aperture a bit more from, Claude was for a while the go-to for a lot of coders, as one of the better tools to use to edit across, a vast array of files and really churn out entire apps in some cases, through the power of a lot of this generative AI. But the piece focuses more on the general purpose use cases of a lot of these new updates that Claude has pushed out, with allowing people to automate a lot of their daily tasks. This is kind of the big promise of agents that really hasn't been solved yet. And this is kind of a glimpse of what that future can look like, being able to sort through dozens of emails and automate a lot of your daily tasks is stuff that, will be of real value to people like my mom and dad. And that is really where the value of this stuff is. I think, of course, there's benefit in tailoring to the coders initially, but the real money is when everyday people want to use this stuff and find a reason to go out of their way to change their habits, because in the end of the day, it's all a very habitual ritual task with a lot of these everyday items. It's a good piece that highlights a bit of that and how the trends are turning. But yeah, I'd love to hear what your obsession was.
No, I think without coordinating this week, both our obsessions kind of converged, because the place I've been obsessing on this weekend and the last few days has been Claude Code. I've been mucking around with it, downloaded it, I've used it on a bunch of different projects, etc., with varying degrees of success. It's extraordinarily capable, and it's not just for coders. I think that is the one big takeaway, especially since they also rolled out something called Claude CoWork, which is a much more Windows-based kind of a system to run projects of all types beyond coding. And I've been having a lot of fun with it. I don't think it's quite ready for your mom and dad, but it is a pointer to where this stuff will eventually go very quickly, not just from Anthropic's product, but also potentially others. But Anthropic right now is in the lead. A lot of mainstream early adopters and so on have been totally enchanted and enamored, I would say, with Claude Code and Claude CoWork. The YouTube is filled with videos of this. I've been watching a lot of them in terms of the projects, and that's been kind of an inspiration for me to kind of kick around some of this stuff. So that's been part of my obsession as well. And I would encourage everyone to at least be familiar with this, read up on the articles and so on that we'll put up in the show notes. Which brings us to our burning questions. And I'll kick it off with burning question for you, since we were talking about playing with applications and so on. And 26 is now off with to a running start. So Neal, what are your AI resolutions for 2026, if any?
I think in terms of my AI resolutions, it's a pretty good question. On just the everyday side of things where I'm using it for myself, I think, just through college that there is an easy tendency sometimes to go to ChatGPT for stuff that maybe I would earlier go to Google for. And I do catch myself a lot sometimes where every now and then I'll just have a chat instance open and I'll be working on something else and I'll have a question about something that I would typically Google, and I'll just, for the sake of ease of use, I'll ask in ChatGPT and I'll get, an answer. And a lot of times I'll have to re-answer that same answer in Google to get, maybe a bit more of a specific, reliable answer. And I think that's one habit that I would maybe want to change a bit more this year, is to be intentional with where I'm asking these questions, because until we get to this one, singularity, unified model where we can do everything, it is important to keep cognizant of the fact that some of these things are better at some things than others. So don't be as lazy, I guess, is the underlying thing. Don't be as lazy with how you use these things. Know that some of them are better for some things than others, and then that when you're actually trying to get the answers you want, it might be better to spend a bit more of the legwork to go to the right place.
Good advice. Experiment and don't get stuck in a rut. Yeah. And we're still early days, so I think it's good to kind of try all the new things and then make up your mind. Good advice. What is your burning question for me to wind things down here?
I guess for the whole topic of Apple and Google and Gemini powered Siri. I guess I can do a quick check-in before we see a future in a couple months where this changes. But right now, what would you say your go-to voice assistant is? Again, I know, contrary to the answer I just gave for your question, it's not always one place you go for these
Yeah.
things. But I guess what are your habits in this?
Yeah, because of what we do, I try to use them all. So I've been constantly using Alexa Plus, where it's available, monitoring its capabilities. Same thing with Siri still, despite we don't have the Gemini powered version, and then obviously Perplexity Voice, ChatGPT, of course, and Google Gemini. But having said all that, in terms of trying to coalesce my daily habits, I have been, and I've said this before, I have been moving more to Google Gemini in terms of my daily just in and out work flow, etc. For a bunch of reasons. I find it's relatively good enough, and if not better than any of the alternatives, including ChatGPT. Number one. Number two, it's convenient. It's where I am all day long in my Chrome browsers, etc. I'm already in Google. I use AI Overview a lot. AI mode. And I think one of the things about voice is that voice is not a standalone discipline. It kind of works together with all these other things. And I think Google particularly does a good job of fusing these capabilities. So Google tends to be my bias, my lean in for this year, but I'm still plugging along with almost everything else. So,
Great.
so that kind of winds up our episode 38 for this second half of January 2026. I want to thank you again for joining us. As usual, comments, suggestions, feedback, always appreciated, as are likes and subscriptions. And we look forward to seeing you again for episode 39 next week. Thanks again for joining us. Stay tuned.
Thank you.